the Lucci case is another example of these cases that we keep looking at with regard to whether the police have gone too far. Has the investigative mechanism that was used to cause someone to commit a crime, has it gone too far that we're not willing to sanction that conduct by allowing the police to get a conviction and thereby continue to do it in other cases? This raises two really important questions. Are we catching a criminal or creating a criminal? So if a person regularly sells drugs or buys drugs, and we set up a sting operation and they come in and they buy the drugs or sell the drugs, then we're getting someone on a crime that they're otherwise out there committing, and that it would be difficult for us to catch the person in the act of committing. And you can imagine all kinds of crimes that we don't want to go on unabated because we can't find them in the middle of it, particularly crimes of terrorism. And after 9/11, the question of whether sting operations that induced people to make statements that suggested they were involved in conspiracies, whether those were actually creating terrorists or whether those were catching would-be terrorists. Because obviously in that context, you want to be particularly aggressive in preventing the crime from happening. So this was a huge issue after 9/11. But with ordinary drug cases, like the Lucci case, we find it convenient to do these sting operations because you're just not going to be out and about catching people doing this because it happens behind closed doors, in dark street alleys, and moving or passing cars, etc. So in the Lucci case, the question was the police conduct too egregious for us to sanction? Because Pennsylvania uses the objective test that simply asks whether this conduct was so egregious that it would have convinced someone to commit a crime who was not otherwise predisposed to it, regardless of whether this particular defendant was predisposed to commit the crime. And in this case, the court says, we don't care what the jury says. As a matter of law, we don't think any reasonable jury should be able to say that this conduct is acceptable, that this type of investigative technique is acceptable. And what had they done? They had a friend of the defendant, Lucci, had agreed to be a paid informant for the police. And the informant knew that the defendant had just finished up rehab. And the informant also had claimed to have just finished up rehab. And so he's talking to the defendant and says, look, I know you just finished up rehab. I know you're clean, but my mom is dying. And I need a fix to get me through this hard time. Can you help me? And at first the defendant doesn't want to go along. And then after he badgers him, he plays upon this friendship, and he plays upon someone who's trying to turn his life around, trying to get clean. And he uses the weakness of this particular defendant as a way to convince him. He plays upon his weakness and his sympathy for the informant, who claims to, and whose mother actually was dying, I think. The case suggests that she actually was dying. So in a case like that, we just don't like the idea that the police play on those types of weaknesses, regardless of whether this person might have been predisposed. It's all the more egregious that here's someone trying to turn their life around, and this agent of the police is out there trying to get them to fall off the wagon. And so the court in this case says, this is too much, this is entrapment. Along the way, they give us the analogy of the Thompson case, where the police used a particularly attractive female undercover agent to induce a middle-aged guy who was having some trouble at home to buy her drugs. She befriends him, lets him believe that they're in some sort of amorous relationship, and then uses that relationship that he otherwise seemingly wouldn't have been able to acquire under normal circumstances. In order to stay in this relationship, she gets him to procure drugs for her. And the court says, again, this is something we don't want the police to be doing. This is not an appropriate investigative technique. You are, in this case, even if this defendant would have been willing to have bought drugs or obtained drugs otherwise, this is too much. If you do this to other people, there are people who otherwise wouldn't do this crime, whom you have induced into committing it. You are creating criminals rather than catching criminals. And so in Thompson and in Lucci, with the playing on the weaknesses of the friend, both his sympathies for the guy's dying mother, and his friends need to get over that, and his weakness as someone who's recently gone through rehabilitation. The court says you just shouldn't be doing this as law enforcement officers, and we're not going to give you this conviction because we want to deter you from doing this in the future. The idea of denying the government a conviction to prevent that type of tactic in the future is very consistent with what you will see when you get to criminal procedure and looking at Fourth Amendment search and seizure law. There's a lot of analogy between that and this, and you'll see that when we get there.